They thought your silence would break you, but somewhere inside that silence, you were becoming the one person they were never prepared to lose. At first, they probably did not understand what was happening. They were used to your presence, your questions, your effort, your attempts to fix the distance between you. Maybe they had learned that when they pulled away, you would eventually reach toward them. Maybe they believed your attachment to them was stronger than your ability to walk away. So when you became quiet, they may have thought it was temporary. A few hours, a few days, a short emotional reaction before you returned to the same familiar pattern. But you did not, and that changed everything, because silence is strange. In the beginning, it can look like weakness. It can look like sadness. It can look like someone sitting alone, waiting for a message that never comes. But silence can also become something else. It can become the place where confusion begins to clear. It can become the space where you finally hear the thoughts that were buried beneath all the chasing, explaining, hope and waiting. You may know exactly what that waiting feels like. A message goes unanswered, and suddenly it is no longer just a message. It starts becoming a question about your worth. You wonder whether you said too much, whether you cared too much, whether you pushed them away, whether someone else became more important, whether you misunderstood the entire connection, and little by little, their distance begins occupying more space in your mind than their actual presence ever did. That is where the real pain starts. Not only because they became distant, but because your mind kept trying to solve the distance. You replayed conversations, you searched for the exact moment something changed, you looked for hidden meanings in short replies. You tried to understand why someone who once felt so close could suddenly feel so unreachable. And when there was no clear answer, you may have started blaming yourself. But there is something important you need to understand. The human mind does not like uncertainty. When someone gives you warmth and then distance, closeness and then withdrawal, reassurance and then silence, the mind often searches even harder for resolution. The uncertainty can keep your attention locked onto the person, not because they are necessarily your destiny, not because the connection is spiritually guaranteed, but because your nervous system wants an answer. That is why sometimes the person who gives you the least clarity can occupy the most space in your mind. Ride that again, tintist yourself. The person who gives you the least clarity can occupy the most space in your mind. Most people will never hear this, not because it is hidden, but because they stop too soon. They assume the pain means the connection must be powerful. They assume the obsession means the bond must be rare. They assume the inability to let go proves that this person is somehow meant for them. But sometimes pain is not proof of destiny. Sometimes pain is proof that something inside you is still searching for safety. And this is where your silence begins to mean something very different. Maybe you stopped reaching out because you were exhausted. Maybe you finally realized that every conversation seemed to leave you with more questions than answers. Maybe you understood that asking someone to choose you over and over again was slowly teaching you to abandon yourself. So you became quiet, not because you stopped caring overnight, not because you suddenly became cold, not because the memories disappeared. You became quiet because something inside you finally said, enough, enough explaining, enough chasing, enough trying to prove that your heart was worth handling gently. And here is the part they may not have expected. Your silence removed something they had become comfortable with access, the certainty that you were still there, the reassurance that no matter how distant they became, you would keep the emotional door open. When that certainty disappears, the entire dynamic can change. At first, someone who tends to pull away from emotional closeness may even feel relief. Distance can feel safer, less pressure, less vulnerability, fewer difficult conversations. That is an important truth, because this is not a fantasy about someone collapsing the second you stop texting. But relief and healing are not the same thing. And relief can become very different when the person who always returned suddenly does not. But before I tell you why that shift matters, stay with me, because what comes next may completely change the way you understand their silence, your silence, and the strange emotional reversal that can happen when someone finally realizes that your presence was never guaranteed. There is another truth underneath all of this. You may think this story is about whether they miss you. It is not. At least not completely. This story is about why their distance had so much power over you in the first place. It is about why inconsistency can make you chase harder, why silence can initially feel unbearable, why someone who appears emotionally detached may not process loss in the same way or at the same speed as you. And most importantly, it is about the moment your silence stops being a strategy to get them back and becomes a decision to get yourself back, because there is a dangerous trap in this kind of relationship. You can become so focused on whether they regret losing you that you forget to ask whether losing yourself was already too high a price. That question changes everything. Maybe you are listening because someone has gone cold. Maybe you are in no contact. Maybe you are resisting the urge to send the message sitting in your drafts. Maybe part of you still hopes they will wake up one morning and finally understand what they lost. There is no shame in admitting that. But by the end of this video, I want you to understand something deeper than whether they come back. You are going to understand why their withdrawal affected you so strongly, what can happen when the chasing suddenly stops, why silence can create a delayed emotional shift, and why the most powerful outcome is not making them suffer. It is becoming free from needing their suffering to prove your value, because maybe they thought your silence was weakness. Maybe they thought you were sitting somewhere waiting for them to return. Maybe they believed you could not survive the space they created. But while they were interpreting your silence, you were changing inside it. You were learning to sit with the discomfort. You were learning that miss someone does not require returning to them. You were learning that love without emotional safety can slowly become self-abandonment. And eventually, something happened that they never planned for. They thought you were struggling to survive their absence. They did not realize you were learning how to survive without them. Welcome to the channel. If you are rebuilding yourself, learning to protect your peace, and trying to understand the deeper meaning behind the relationships that changed you, subscribe and stay with me. Because this is not only about why they pulled away, it is about who you become when you finally stop running after them.
Here's the part most people get wrong about silence.
Sometimes, when you finally stop reaching for an avoidant person, the first thing they feel is not pain, it is relief. That may hurt to hear. Especially if you were the one who spent nights staring at your phone, wondering why they could disappear so easily. Especially if you were the one carrying the weight of unfinished conversations, unanswered questions, and the constant fear that maybe you cared more than they did. You may have hoped that the moment you stopped chasing, they would instantly feel your absence, that they would panic, that they would finally understand what they had done. But human emotions are rarely that simple. For someone who leans strongly toward avoidant attachment patterns, closeness can sometimes feel like pressure. Emotional conversations can feel overwhelming. Expectations can feel dangerous. Being needed can feel less like love and more like responsibility. So when distance suddenly appears, their nervous system may experience something that looks like calm. There is less to explain, less to respond to, less vulnerability, less emotional intensity. And for a moment that can feel easier. Do not skip this part, because this is where most people make one of the biggest mistakes. They see that temporary relief and assume it means the other person never cared. They assume the silence proves the relationship meant nothing. They start questioning every memory, every promise, every moment when the connection felt real. But relief does not always mean lack of love. Sometimes relief simply means the pressure has stopped. A person can miss you and still feel overwhelmed by intimacy. A person can care and still have poor emotional skills. A person can feel attached and still run when closeness forces them to face things inside themselves that they have spent years avoiding. That does not excuse hurtful behavior. It does not mean you should tolerate inconsistencies. And it certainly does not mean you should keep chasing someone because you understand why they pull away. Understanding explains behavior. It does not make the behavior healthy. One lesser-known thing about avoidant attachment is that distancing is often not completely conscious. People do not always sit down and decide, I am going to shut off my feelings now. It can happen automatically. Their attention moves toward your flaws. They become unusually focused on reasons the relationship cannot work. They feel irritated by closeness that once felt comforting. They begin telling themselves they need space. Psychologists sometimes call these patterns deactivating strategies. The person lowers the emotional importance of the bond so they can regain a sense of independence. To you, it can look cold. To them, it can feel like survival. And if you were the one waiting on the other side, that difference can feel brutal. You may have interpreted their distance as a message about your value. Maybe you thought, if I were better, they would stay. If I were calmer, they would open up. If I asked for less, maybe they would stop pulling away. If I gave them more space, maybe they would finally choose me. And without realizing it, you started shrinking yourself to make their discomfort easier. That is where love becomes dangerous. Not because loving someone is wrong, but because you start using your own disappearance as proof that you are understanding. You stop asking for what you need. You stop bringing up what hurts. You learn to accept crumbs because you are afraid that asking for the whole meal will make them leave. And then one day, you become silent. Maybe not because you are trying to teach them a lesson, maybe because you are simply tired. And in the beginning, they may feel that pressure lift. But here is the truth nobody says out loud. Relief is not healing. Silence can remove the immediate discomfort without removing the deeper pattern. The absence of conflict can feel peaceful, even when nothing inside the person has actually changed, and that difference matters more than you know, because once the pressure disappears, something else has room to appear. And what appears next is where the story starts becoming very different. The first few days of distance can feel familiar to them. Maybe this has happened before. They pulled away. You worried. They became quiet. You reached out. They asked for space. You gave it for a while. Then eventually, someone broke the silence. And if that someone was usually you, the pattern became predictable. They may not have consciously planned it. But the nervous system learns patterns quickly. Distance did not always mean loss. Distance meant temporary separation. Distance meant breathing room. Distance meant that sooner or later you would return, your message would appear, your concern would return, your warmth would be available again, and that gave them a quiet kind of reassurance. They could move away without fully experiencing what it meant to lose you. That is why your silence can feel so different when it continues. At first, they may expect the familiar ending. They may assume you are upset. They may think you need a few days. They may tell themselves you are trying to get a reaction. They may even believe that if they wait long enough, your feelings will pull you back toward them, because that is what happened before. But then another day passes, and another. The message does not come. Your name does not appear on their screen. The apology they expected does not arrive. The explanation they thought you would eventually offer never comes. And slowly, the space begins to feel different. Do not rush through this part, because this is where silence stops being just silence. It becomes uncertainty. Before, they knew where you were emotionally. Even when they were distant, they knew you cared. Even when they ignored you, they knew you were thinking about them. Even when they withdrew, your attempts to repair the connection told them something important. You were still there. But now they no longer have that proof. That changes the emotional equation. Not always dramatically, not always immediately, but quietly. The predictable ending is gone, and people often feel most secure when they know what happens next. When they do not know, the mind starts filling in the blanks. Maybe you are healing, maybe you are moving on, maybe you are tired, maybe someone else has your attention, maybe you finally saw the pattern clearly. Maybe this time you really meant it when you stepped away. The same uncertainty that once lived inside, you can begin appearing on the other side. And this is the reversal nobody expects. You spent so much time asking yourself whether they would return. Now, the possibility exists that they may start wondering whether you will. That does not mean they are suffering every second. It does not mean they are secretly watching everything you do. It does not mean silence is some magical technique for controlling another person. It means something simpler. A familiar emotional pattern has been interrupted. And when patterns are interrupted, the mind notices. You were the part of the cycle that kept making distance safe. Your return softened the consequences of their withdrawal. Your reassurance made separation temporary. Your willingness to reopen the door made it easier for them to close it. Then one day, that changed, not because you became cruel, because you became tired of proving your love to someone who kept testing whether you would remain. Here is the truth nobody says out loud. Sometimes people do not realize how much emotional security they receive from someone until that person stops supplying it. Not because they are evil, not because they are consciously using you, but because human beings become accustomed to what is consistently available. And what is consistently available becomes easy to underestimate. Your attention, your patience, your forgiveness, your emotional labor, your willingness to understand, your ability to see goodness in them even when they were difficult to reach. All of that may have become part of their emotional environment. Then suddenly, it is not there. And the next question becomes much more uncomfortable. What happens when they realize you are no longer waiting exactly where they left you? For a long time, your actions may have answered the question for them. Do you still care?
Yes, you reached out. Are you still available?
Yes, you responded. Will you forgive them? Yes. You reopen the conversation. Can they come back after disappearing? Yes. You let them return. Your consistency may have become evidence. Evidence that the connection still existed even when they were not tending to it. Evidence that your feelings were strong enough to survive their distance. Evidence that you were still emotionally nearby. Then you stopped providing evidence. And that is where uncertainty grows. They cannot simply look at your behavior and know the answer anymore. Maybe you still care, maybe you do not. Maybe you miss them, maybe you are finally starting to prefer your peace. Maybe the door is open, maybe it is closing. Maybe it is already closed. That uncertainty can matter because human beings often do not value access until access becomes uncertain. Do not misunderstand this. The goal is not to make someone anxious. The goal is not to disappear so they chase you. The goal is not to turn silence into punishment. If silence becomes a strategy designed to force a reaction, then you are still emotionally controlled by the same person. You are still checking, still waiting, still measuring whether your absence worked, still asking whether they noticed. That is not freedom, that is chasing in reverse. And you deserve something deeper than that. Your boundary becomes powerful when it stops depending on their response. That is where the spiritual shift begins. You stop asking, did they notice my silence? And you start asking, what am I hearing now that I am no longer drowning in their mixed signals? You stop asking, do they miss me? And you start asking, why did I believe their attention was the measure of my worth? You stop asking, when will they come back? And you start asking, who am I becoming while they are gone? Those questions change you. Because maybe the biggest wound was never their silence. Maybe it was the way their silence made you abandon your own inner voice. You knew something was wrong. You felt the inconsistency. You noticed how anxious you became. You noticed how carefully you chose your words. You noticed how often you accepted less than you needed. But every time your intuition whispered, this is hurting you, hope answered, maybe tomorrow will be different. And hope can be beautiful. But hope without boundaries can become a prison. Do not skip this part, because the next truth can save you months, sometimes years, of emotional confusion. Not every avoidant person comes back. Not every avoidant person regrets leaving. Not every avoidant person secretly wants the relationship restored. Some move forward, some stay distant, some never develop enough self-awareness to understand what happened. And strangely, accepting that possibility is where your power returns. Because the moment your healing depends on whether someone regrets losing you, they still control the ending. Your life is still waiting on their realization. Your self-worth is still waiting on their apology. Your peace is still waiting on their return. But the moment you say, even if they never understand, I understand, something changes. You become free from needing the person who hurt you to agree that you deserved better. Here is the truth nobody says out loud. The strongest boundary is not the one that makes someone chase you. It is the one you keep, even when nobody applauds you for keeping it. And once that boundary becomes real, a strange emotional question begins forming on the other side. Because when your reassurance disappears, feelings that were easy to keep buried may no longer stay buried forever. And that is where the timing of emotion becomes far more mysterious than most people realize. Some feelings do not arrive when the event happens. They arrive when the defenses around the event become tired. That sounds strange at first. We tend to think emotion works immediately. Something happens. We feel it. We understand it. We process it. Then we move forward. But emotional processing is not always that clean. Some people feel almost everything immediately. They cry, they talk, they replay, they seek reassurance, they want answers. Others respond very differently. They become practical, detached, buzzy, numb. They tell themselves they are fine. They focus on work. They distract themselves. They emphasize the problems in the relationship. They convince themselves the ending was necessary. They create emotional distance before the full meaning of the loss has settled in. That is not necessarily manipulation. Sometimes it is simply the way their mind has learned to manage emotional intensity. Here is a surprising lesser-known idea. Some emerging attachment models suggest that avoidant patterns may involve reducing attention to internal emotional signals when those signals threaten a person's sense of independence or safety. This is still a developing way of understanding attachment, not a final answer, but emotionally, it explains something many people notice. A person can look calm before they have actually processed what happened. The absence of visible emotion is not always the absence of emotion itself. Sometimes the feeling has simply not been allowed all the way into awareness yet. You may know the opposite experience. You felt everything at once. Their silence hit you immediately. You could barely concentrate. You woke up thinking about them. You went to sleep thinking about them. Your mind wanted answers now. So when you saw them appear calm, maybe even happy, it felt unfair. You thought, how can I be carrying all of this while they seem untouched? That question can destroy your confidence if you let it, because you start assuming visible calm means deeper strength. It does not. Sometimes the person who feels early processes early. Sometimes the person who avoids processes pace late. And sometimes people never fully process at all. There is no universal schedule. That is why comparing your grief to their silence is dangerous. Your tears do not mean you lost. Their calm does not mean they won. Your emotional honesty may actually be the thing helping you heal. You are feeling the pain instead of running from it. You are sitting inside the truth. You are learning what the relationship brought out in you. You are seeing where you abandoned yourself. That hurts, but pain that is faced can move. Pain that is constantly avoided often waits, and this is where the spiritual lesson becomes almost uncomfortable. Sometimes the emotion you refuse today waits for you in tomorrow's silence, not because the universe is punishing anyone, not because karma is sitting with a stopwatch, because unprocessed experience has a way of resurfacing when distraction becomes quiet. The conversation ends, the excitement fades, the new routine becomes ordinary, the relief settles, and then memory starts speaking differently. Do not skip what comes next, because this is where many people confuse delayed emotion with sudden love. Someone missing you later does not automatically mean they became capable of loving you better. Someone feeling the loss later does not automatically mean the relationship is now safe. Feeling is only one part, capacity is another. A person can feel deeply and still lack the skills to communicate. They can miss you and still avoid accountability. They can regret what happened and still repeat it. They can love your presence and still run from the intimacy required to keep it. That distinction will matter later. For now, something quieter begins happening. Their life starts introducing them to the reality of your absence, and ordinary life can reveal a loss more clearly than any dramatic goodbye ever could. It is rarely the dramatic moments that make absence feel real, it is the ordinary ones. The tiny habits, the small openings in the day where you used to exist without anyone thinking much about it. A joke happens and there is nobody to send it to. Something stressful happens and the person who used to understand the background is no longer there. A song comes on, a familiar place appears. A quiet night stretches longer than expected. They pick up the phone without thinking, then remember. Or maybe nothing that obvious happens. Maybe it is simply a growing awareness that the emotional support they were used to receiving is missing. That is how loss often becomes real, not as a giant wave, as hundreds of tiny absences. And you know this because you probably lived through the same thing. You did not only miss the big conversations, you missed their name appearing, the routine, the familiarity, the feeling that there was someone out there connected to your day. That is why letting go can hurt, even when you know the relationship was unhealthy. You are not only letting go of a person, you are letting go of patterns your nervous system became familiar with. They may experience something similar, even if their emotional style looks completely different. Again, That does not mean they are secretly obsessed with you. Do not build your healing around fantasies you cannot confirm, but absence changes the emotional landscape. It creates contrast. Before, your presence was ordinary. Now your absence becomes noticeable. Before, they could assume you were emotionally nearby. Now they have to live without that assumption. And over time, the difference becomes harder to ignore. Here is the truth nobody says out loud. Sometimes people miss the way you loved them before they fully understand that they miss you. They miss the ease, the support, the person who remembered small things, the person who listened, the person who cared how their day went, the person who made space for them, even when they struggled to make space for you. Then a harder realization can follow. That kind of presence was attached to a real human being, and that human being became tired. You may feel emotional hearing that because part of you still wants them to understand. That is human. You invested in something real. You gave time you cannot get back. You forgave things you probably should have questioned sooner. You stayed during periods when leaving would have protected you. Of course, part of you wants the story to mean something. Of course, part of you wants them to look back and say, I should have treated that person differently. But your healing cannot wait for that sentence. Whether they say it or never say it, the truth remains. You were there, you tried, you cared, you learned, and eventually you stopped. That is enough. Do not skip this next part, because this is where the entire direction of the story changes. Until now, we have been talking about what your absence may create in them, but the real transformation begins when your attention stops asking what your absence is doing to them, because that is the moment your energy finally comes home. There is a moment in healing that nobody can see from the outside. Nothing dramatic happens, no message arrives, no apology changes your life. No perfect conversation gives you closure. You simply wake up one morning and realize you did not check. You did not look at their profile. You did not wonder whether they were online. You did not build an imaginary conversation in your head while getting ready. For a few minutes, maybe an hour, they were not the center of your internal world. That moment seems small. It is not. It means your attention is returning. For months, maybe longer, your attention may have been orbiting them. Their moods affected your mood. Their replies affected your confidence. Their distance changed your entire day. Their silence could make you question your future. You gave them more mental space than they may have ever understood. Then slowly, that orbit weakens. You start sleeping without the phone beside your face. You stop reading old conversations to find clues. You stop mentally preparing the perfect speech in case they return. You stop looking for hidden messages in songs, posts, timing, or coincidences. You stop turning every quiet night into evidence that something is wrong with you. And life begins becoming yours again. This is where spiritual healing becomes very practical. It is not about pretending you never cared. It is not about becoming emotionally cold. It is not about declaring that you are above love. It is about learning that your attention is sacred. Where your attention goes, your emotional life follows. If your attention is constantly reaching towards someone who is unavailable, part of you remains emotionally unavailable to yourself. That is why letting go can feel like waking up. You start noticing your own needs again. You remember interests that had nothing to do with them. You laugh without wondering whether they would understand the joke. You make plans without secretly hoping those plans will make them jealous. You wear something because you like it, not because part of you wants them to see it. You begin living without performing your healing for the person who hurt you. Do not skip this part, because this is the point where silence changes meaning. The silence did not become powerful because it punished them. It became powerful because it finally protected you. That is the shift. Before, silence felt empty. Now it feels spacious. Before, it felt like rejection. Now it begins feeling like a boundary. Before, you were counting how many days had passed since they contacted you. Now you are beginning to forget to count. And when you stop counting, you stop. That may be one of the most important spiritual milestones in the entire process. Waiting keeps part of your life suspended. Healing begins moving again. You are no longer saying, my life will begin when they apologize. You are saying, my life is already happening. You are no longer saying, I will feel valuable when they understand what they lost. You are saying, their awareness has nothing to do with my value. You are no longer saying, I hope they come back. Starting to ask, would I even want the old version of this relationship back? That question can shock you because once you start healing, the relationship you were begging to save can begin looking very different. You notice how much anxiety you normalized, how much inconsistency you called chemistry, how much emotional deprivation you called patience, how often you accepted confusion because the connection felt intense. Intensity is not the same thing as intimacy. Missing someone is not the same thing as being safe with them, and loving someone is not the same thing as being able to build a healthy life with them. Here is the truth nobody says out loud. Sometimes healing does not bring the person back, it brings your standards back. And once your standards return, the door they left open may no longer lead to the version of you they remember. That is when the title begins becoming real in a deeper way. Because the thing that can break is not necessarily them, it is the assumption that you will always be available. And once that assumption breaks, consequences finally become real. When people hear the phrase, "it broke them" instead, they often think of dramatic regret, sleepless nights, begging, obsessing, instant realization. But that is not the most important meaning. The deeper break is the collapse of an assumption. The assumption that you will always answer, that you will always forgive, that you will always understand, that your love is endless, even when their effort is not. Maybe they did not think of it consciously. Most emotional patterns are not written out in words. They are felt. They simply became accustomed to the fact that you remained accessible, then you did not. And reality changed. For the first time, distance carried a consequence. They could withdraw, but you might not be there when they returned. They could avoid the conversation, but avoiding the conversation might cost them the connection. They could keep choosing emotional safety over vulnerability. But eventually, someone else might choose peace over waiting. That is consequence, not revenge, not punishment. Consequence. And consequences are often what finally make patterns visible. As a behavior never costs anything, there is little pressure to examine it. If someone disappears and the relationship returns exactly as before, they may learn nothing. If they avoid every difficult conversation and you keep repairing everything, the pattern stays comfortable. If they repeatedly offer inconsistency and still receive your full emotional availability, the relationship teaches them that inconsistency works, then one day it does not. And the loss forces a question they may have avoided for a long time. What did my behavior actually create? That question can hurt, because sometimes the hardest loss is not losing someone. It is realizing you were the reason they finally learned to leave. Sit with that for a moment. Maybe you spent months thinking they were the strong one because they could detach. Maybe you saw yourself as weak because you cared openly, but leaving a pattern that repeatedly hurts you takes a different kind of strength. It is quiet. It does not always feel powerful when you are doing it. Sometimes it feels terrible. Sometimes you still cry. Sometimes you still miss this. Sometimes you almost send the message. Strength does not mean the absence of longing. Strength means longing no longer makes your decisions for you. Do not skip this part, because the biggest mistake often happens right after someone finally becomes strong enough to walk away. That is when the other person sometimes returns. And that return can feel like proof that the silence worked, proof that they cared, proof that the bond was real, proof that you were right to wait. But this is exactly where you need more clarity than emotion, because someone returning can reopen the wound you just learned how to close. And what happens next will reveal whether they missed you or whether they actually changed. The message appears. Maybe it is simple. Hey, I have been thinking about you. How have you been? I miss talking to you. I made a mistake. Maybe your heart reacts before your mind does. Your body remembers the connection. Your hands feel different holding the phone. The person you spent weeks trying not to think about is suddenly right there again. And all the healing you thought was permanent suddenly feels fragile. That does not mean you failed. It means attachment does not disappear just because you understand it. You can know someone hurt you and still feel warmth when they return. You can know the pattern was unhealthy and still want to believe this time is different. You can be stronger than before and still feel tempted. That is why this moment can be more dangerous than the original silence. When they were gone, reality was clear. They were unavailable. When they return, hope comes back with them, and hope is powerful. Hope can make one message feel like transformation. It can make regret sound like accountability. It can make missing you sound like readiness. But those things are not the same. Do not skip this part, because this distinction can protect your future. Missing you does not mean they are ready for intimacy. Regret does not mean they have developed emotional maturity. Loneliness does not mean they have learned how to communicate. Coming back does not mean they know how to stay. Ride those lines carefully inside yourself. Someone can diss what you gave them without being ready to give you what you need. Someone can feel genuine pain and still repeat the same pattern. Someone can apologize and still lack the skills required for a healthy relationship. Feelings matter, but behavior tells you what those feelings can actually build. So if they return, ask different questions. Not, do they still love me? Ask, are they communicating differently? Not, did they miss me? Ask, can they stay present when the conversation becomes uncomfortable? Not, do they regret leaving? Ask, can they take responsibility without blaming fear, stress, timing, or you? Not, are they saying the right words? Ask, are their actions stable after the emotional reunion fades? Not, do I still feel chemistry? Ask, do I feel emotionally safe? That last question matters, because sometimes the old chemistry was partly anxiety, the uncertainty, the chase, the relief when they finally responded, the fear when they pulled away again. Your body can become so used to instability that calm initially feels unfamiliar. That is why some people return to painful relationships and call it love. The pattern feels known feels safe, even when it hurts. Here is the truth nobody says out loud. Familiar pain can feel more comfortable than unfamiliar peace. And that is why your healing needs discernment. If they come back, do not punish them. Do not play games. Do not force them to prove themselves through suffering. Simply observe, watch consistency, watch responsibility. Watch whether they respect your boundaries when those boundaries inconvenience them. Watch what happens after the first emotional conversation. Anyone can be vulnerable for one night. Can they remain emotionally present 2 weeks later, 1 month later? When fear returns, when intimacy feels real again, when conflict appears. That is where change reveals itself. True transformation does not only sound different, it behaves differently. Maybe they have changed. People can grow. Avoidant patterns are not life sentences. Self-awareness, therapy, honest reflection, and healthier relationships can change how someone responds to closeness. But your job is not to build their transformation for them. Your love cannot do their inner work. Your patience cannot manufacture their emotional readiness. Your understanding cannot replace their accountability. You can walk beside someone who is growing. You cannot grow for them. And if they return only because your absence became uncomfortable, without addressing the pattern that created the separation, then the old cycle is still waiting underneath the reunion. That is the danger. Your heart sees the person. Your nervous system remembers the bond. Your hope sees the future. But wisdom remembers the pattern. Do not abandon that wisdom because the person finally said the words you once begged to hear. You wanted those words when you were starving for reassurance. Lie. You are not that person anymore. Or at least, you do not have to be. Maybe the greatest test of your healing is not whether you can survive their absence. Maybe it is whether you can protect your peace when their presence becomes available again. Because silence taught you who you were without them. Their return may reveal whether you truly believe what you learned. And the next part is where everything becomes even more uncomfortable. Because there is one question almost nobody asks when an avoidant comes back. It is not, why did they return? It is this, why do you still want them to? Maybe they miss you now. Maybe they regret what they did. Maybe they come back. Maybe they never do. But after everything you have been through, none of those outcomes should decide whether your healing was real. You started this journey wondering whether your silence would affect them. You wanted to know whether they would notice, whether they would feel the absence, whether the person who once seemed so comfortable pulling away would finally understand what they had lost. But somewhere along the way, the question changed. It stopped being, do they miss me? And it became, why did I need their missing me to prove that I mattered? That is the real transformation. You learn that silence can bring relief before it brings realization. You learn that some feelings arrive late. You learn that absence can make people notice what constant access allowed them to overlook. But more importantly, you learn that your peace cannot depend on someone else finally becoming aware of your value. Before you go, hear this one last thing carefully, because it may be the most important thing in this entire video. The real victory was never making them miss you. The real victory was becoming someone who no longer needs to beg another person to choose them. That is freedom. You thought silence meant nothing was happening. But inside that silence, something sacred was happening. You were returning to yourself. Your attention was coming home. Your standards were waking up. Your nervous system was learning that peace does not have to be earned through someone else's approval. And by the time they understood what your absence meant, you were no longer standing where they left you. Everything you just heard, some part of you already knew. Deep inside, beneath the fear, beneath the waiting, beneath the need for one more answer, you knew. You just needed to hear it clearly enough to trust yourself again. So for the next 7 days, make yourself one promise. Do not use silence to make anyone chase you. Use silence to hear yourself again. Stop checking for evidence that they miss you. Stop searching for signs that they regret losing you. And when the urge rises, ask yourself one honest question. Do I truly miss this person, or do I miss the feeling of finally being chosen by them? Your answer may change more than you expect. And if this message met you at a time when you needed it, stay close to this channel. Subscribe for more conversations like this, and like the video if it helped you see your situation differently. Not for the algorithm, for the simple reason that someone else may be searching for these words tonight too. Keep choosing your peace, even when nobody notices, especially then.